Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Andrea Weckerly, and welcome to the Ready Living Podcast, where each episode is designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to create the life you want. Thanks for joining us, and remember to subscribe for free on your favorite platform. My guest today is Viktorya Vilk. She is the Director for Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America and created and runs the organization's Digital Safety Program, which equips writers and journalists with online abuse self-defense training and resources, partners with media organizations and publishers to strengthen protections for writers and journalists, and conducts research and advocacy on platform accountability. Her work has been featured on PBS NewsHour, The New York Times, Slate, and Harvard Business Review, and she regularly speaks at conferences on digital safety and press freedom, including for the Online News Association, RightsCon, and International Journalism Festival, among others. She completed graduate degrees as a Marshall Scholar at the University of London and has over 15 years of experience working in nonprofits to expand access to the arts and defend creative and press freedom. Welcome, Viktorya.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Let's start with the big picture, namely the state of affairs with regard to freedom of expression around the world. In a Miami Herald op-ed you co-authored with Timothy Richardson, you wrote, "The global attacks against journalism and the informed citizenry it fosters are deployed by powerful figures such as Donald Trump and Elon Musk in the US, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, Vladimir Putin in Russia, and Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, all of whom seek to vilify the press and shield themselves from scrutiny. Each is drawing on the same authoritarian playbook." What specifically does this playbook look like?
Unfortunately, it's a tried and true playbook that's been honed over decades, or potentially one could argue hundreds of years, by strong men all around the world. The thing is that if a free and independent press is working the way it's supposed to, it is set up to hold the powerful, particularly governments and corporations, accountable to the public. And so if you are a government that wants to shift from a democratic form of governance to an authoritarian form of governance, you are not going to want to be held accountable to the public, especially if you're also intertwined with a bunch of tech oligarchs. There is a lot of motivation from the federal government and arguably also in the corporate sector to go after a free and independent press and try to undermine it. And the attacks that are used are myriad and they're intertwined. And that could be legal. It could be digital, it could be physical, it can also be psychological warfare. So you'll see Trump insulting, calling out and threatening female reporters on an almost daily basis, calling them piggy, calling them all kinds of other horrific things, telling them they're stupid. You'll see defamation lawsuits against journalists and news organizations to try to basically bully them into being afraid to do the work that they're doing. You'll see investigations and surveillance from the Justice Department, the FBI, and other agencies that are part of the federal government against journalist outlets and their sources. We've seen the weaponization of the Federal Communications Commission against journalism organizations. So you've got that whole category of attacks. Then you've got things that are focused on restricting and reshaping access. So who gets access to the president? Who gets access to the Pentagon? You'll see, for example, that the Pentagon has now forced most independent reporters out of the building because they refused to sign a Pledge of Allegiance saying that they would run everything by Pete Hegseth before they published it. So obviously they're not going to do that. So none of them are in the building anymore. The White House press pool has forced out multiple reporters at outlets that the press pool doesn't like. That is pretty unprecedented. You'll see things like the decimation and the corporate consolidation of truly local reporting. The media ecosystem is owned by a handful of billionaires and corporations, and so trying to squeeze those journalists in those organizations can be helpful if you're trying to control the message. And finally, the kind of polluting of the information landscape by flooding the zone with lies so that the public doesn't know who or what to believe. So these are some of the kinds of tactics you'll see all of these strongmen leaders using against the press.
I want to quickly mention something that I came across not that long ago, and that was a Guardian article that reported on the BBC's censoring of their presenters and journalists around historian and best-selling author Rutger Bregman's 2025 Reith Lecture titled Moral Ambition. The BBC instructed them not to report on Bregman's criticism of President Trump, apparently because they don't want further legal complications after Trump threatened to sue them over a documentary about a speech he made before the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So censorship appears to happen in preemptory ways as well, right?
I'll tell you some of the key parts of the playbook to answer your question. Control the narrative. You want to control the narrative and the flow of information. You want to silence independent, especially critical voices that are pushing you or trying to hold you accountable to the public. You want to erode trust in the media and institutions, but also in facts and reality writ large. And you want to, this is the most important one, you want to teach people and organizations to self-censor and obey preemptively. You don't actually have to attack every single human being and every single journalism organization, every single institution. You just need enough high profile cases that the fear does the work for you. We've seen, for example, Donald Trump has sued many, many media organizations in the United States. 2 of them capitulated and gave him billions and billions of dollars. And that sends a message to the administration that that kind of shakedown on completely bogus First Amendment grounds, it probably wouldn't have gotten thrown out in court. The shakedown works. And so he then went and used that against the BBC. That's not an accident. That's probably the thing that worries me the most is when trusted and credible institutions and individuals start to preemptively censor themselves and other people and obey in advance.
Universities made agreements with the government because of the pressure that they were under, financial pressure. So we see this in all sorts of other industries as well.
I'm really glad you said that. You asked me, what is the playbook that authoritarians like to deploy? And I told you a bunch of the tactics they tend to use against the press. But the thing to understand is they're not just going after the press. They're going exactly as you said after higher education and the freedom to teach and learn. So they're targeting universities and research programs. They're going after public education, libraries, and the freedom to read, including for children to access books. They're going after cultural sector and artistic freedom. So museums, theaters, cultural institutions. As part of that larger kind of set of attacks, they're also going after free and fair elections, defunding electoral systems, attacking the public servants that actually administer elections, suppressing voting rights, et cetera. The attacks on the press are actually connected to attacks on other sectors that are the pillars that uphold a democracy.
Yeah, that is such an important point. And earlier you also mentioned local journalism, which you covered in your Miami Herald article. Why is local journalism so essential to democracy, and what role has big tech played in the decline?
Yeah, this is a subject I care very deeply about. There's actually been quite a lot of research over many decades now that shows us that local news plays a really vital role in safeguarding community health and welfare and in upholding democracy. There are a couple things it does. It is often a trusted source of really critical information. So think about, for example, if there's a natural disaster, a hurricane or a fire, right? People will turn to their local journalism outlets to know there's a road they shouldn't go down, or there's an agency that is giving some really important announcement that they need to know about. So it's critical information that might be life-saving information. Local news is often an amplifier of local issues so that they rise to the level of regional and national attention. Like I think of the Flint water crisis. That started out as local reporting, but then it was only when national media outlets caught hold of it that there was enough pressure, public attention, et cetera, for any change to start happening. But that would never have happened if there hadn't been local outlets on the ground covering what was happening to Flint communities. It's also a source of social cohesion, people bonding over things that are important to their community. And I would argue maybe the most important role that local journalism plays is that it is a watchdog for corporate and government accountability. There's a lot of research to show that when there's no local journalism, government officials will conduct themselves with less integrity, efficiency, and efficacy. Government salaries go up, taxation goes up, deficit spending goes up, and the amount of federal funding for localities decreases. The problem is that the business model that paid for local journalism for most of American history has collapsed. People think that journalism is free. People got used to not paying for journalism. But you can't actually produce journalism for free. Good journalism costs money. And the way that it was paid for in the past is by selling ads in newspapers and, online, et cetera. However, when tech companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon came onto the scene, they became so incredibly good at feeding you targeted ads because they were surveilling you every second of every day, and they were micro-targeting, exactly figuring out what your interests are and then giving you exactly the ads that you wanted to see. That now those tech companies, because of the surveillance model that they've made their fortune on, they are siphoning more than 70% of the entire ad revenue market. Just 2 companies, Google and Meta, are siphoning more than 70% of the entire ad revenue stream that exists.
That's astounding.
It's crazy, right? It's like if you imagine a small local journalism organization has no chance against players like that. They are finding that they have less and less money to do local journalism. So many outlets are folding. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of news deserts in the country where there is no source of trusted local journalism. And then what happens is that corporations will consolidate these small local outlets into bigger and bigger and bigger corporate entities, but then they will bleed them dry, squeeze out every last drop and leave them as kind of husks. That kind of ecosystem is really concerning.
How did you first get involved in the world of digital safety and free expression? What set you on this path?
I was born in Ukraine, and my family fled when it was still under the control of the Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union collapsed and before Ukraine became an independent country. And of course, now Russia is trying to take it back over. Even though I grew up mostly in the US and in Canada, I was very much raised on dissident art. The Soviet government was an authoritarian regime, and they were incredibly effective authoritarian regimes. So they were very good at suppressing free expression. And so writers, journalists, artists, musicians, filmmakers, scholars, they took great personal risks to create works of art and to create literature and to create original scholarship and get out into the world. And some of them paid the ultimate price. I mean, many of them died. I think that has left me this lifelong passion for and commitment to free expression, because I think I was raised with a very acute understanding of what happens when you don't have freedom of expression in a country. I then started out my career working in visual arts. I worked in museums. And over many years of doing that work, I realized I really wanted to work on free expression directly. And so I shifted to the human rights sector. And believe it or not, there are very few organizations in the entire world that focus on creative and artistic freedom. There are organizations that focus on press freedom. There are about a dozen of them. But there are very few organizations that focus on writers and artists. And PEN America is one of them. And so I had actually known about the PEN Centers since I was a kid. PEN Centers around the world were actually helping authors get their works out into the world. And so I'd known about them. My organization's been around for over 100 years. I just was very, very interested in finding a way to work here. And then a job opened up and I jumped at it. And then somehow I ended up becoming a specialist in press freedom and journalist safety. When I started doing this work around 2018, 2019, journalists were bearing the worst of online hate harassment and threats. And the attacks that we now see happening against scholars and librarians and authors and others started out with journalists.
You run the organization's digital safety program. What exactly does it do?
Thank you so much for asking me that, because I feel so passionately about the work that PEN does and the work that my team does. PEN America, for folks who don't know about us, we're 100 years old. We celebrate and defend the written word. So our constituents are writers of all kinds. They might be journalists, they might be literary writers, they might be scholars. And increasingly, we're also doing a lot of work with librarians because they are on the front lines defending the freedom to read and the freedom to access books. And so that's the kind of overall focus of the organization. My team's focus, our goal is to ensure that writers of all kinds and their allies in the US feel safe and supported enough to continue to use their voices and keep doing the vital work that they do. So even though our primary focus is on digital safety, online spaces, we think about safety holistically, because what we found over many years of doing this work is that the digital, physical, legal, and psychological aspects of safety are totally intertwined.
Absolutely.
If you get a death threat on a DM in a social media platform, it's still a death threat. What you're worried about is your physical safety, and it has a massive impact on your psychological well-being, right? We try to think about all the ways these things are intertwined. Within that bucket, we focus on several things. We focus on providing safety, training, resources, and one-on-one support, the folks who are in our mission, in our constituencies. We collaborate with organizations like news organizations, publishers, universities, and libraries to strengthen safety policies and protocols so that the institution can help protect the people who work within it. We conduct research and advocacy on safety, press freedom, and freedom of expression in the US. And increasingly, we're also working in coalition with partner organizations, nonprofits, other kinds of institutions to really kind of stand up together against abuses of power. We try to think kind of at the micro level and the macro level at the same time, individual, but also systemic.
We hear the term online abuse constantly, but it can mean different things to different people. From your perspective and PEN America's research, what exactly constitutes online abuse, and at what point does someone's behavior move from, let's say, heated debate to real harm and abuse?
The way we define it is the repeated or severe targeting of an individual or group online through harmful behavior. And there's a couple words in there that are important. What we mean by repeated is, one, maybe in some cases, an individual incident of online abuse, like you get some garbagey spam that someone signed you up to, or you get an insult that's unpleasant. It may not feel to you that it rises to the level of abuse, but if you're getting a steady drumbeat of that every day, or you're getting a massive onslaught of that, 4,000 messages in one day, and each individual message doesn't feel to you that painful, but collectively it becomes overwhelming. That's why the repeated piece, that piece around volume, is important. But then severe really gets at the fact that just one incident of online abuse, if it's really frightening, like if somebody threatens you or your family, can be hugely consequential. And so we try to make it clear that online abuse can encompass that kind of range of different tactics or approaches, but it's a very broad term and it covers a lot of different things. It'll cover things like hateful speech, that is targeting someone because of their identity, who they are, how they look. Threats. Physical violence for women and non-binary folks, they often receive threats of sexual violence. threats of rape, threats of other forms of sexualized attack. Hacking, people aren't always sure what hacking means, but hacking is really when somebody literally gets inside one of your accounts. They crack your password and they get in. People often confuse that with impersonation, which is a little different. Impersonation is when somebody takes your photo and your name and makes an account that they pretend to be you, but isn't you. They don't actually have access to any of your accounts. They're just pretending that they're you online. And then swatting is this horrific situation where a harasser will send a fully armed SWAT team or a police force to your house as a hoax, who have been told that something really violent and serious is happening. And then you open the front door and you're looking at a bunch of people pointing guns at you. And so it's extremely high risk. These are just some of the very many tactics that we unfortunately see when people are attacked online.
Not that long ago, Reuters published a special report on how hundreds of people were targeted after speaking critically about the founder of Turning Point USA after his murder, with many of them doxxed. Can you explain a little bit about what doxing is and how it ties into things like coordinated harassment campaigns and watch lists?
I'm glad you asked me about that. And I will tell you that our experience of that, we were inundated with requests for help because so many of the folks that we know in our network were doxxed. Doxing is the publishing of personal identifiable sensitive information online. So it could be your home address, it could be your email, it could be your phone number, and it's without your consent. And the intention is to try to harass, extort, or somehow do you harm. And sometimes someone is put on a publicly visible watch list. That's what happened in many cases with the Charlie Kirk situation. There were these massive websites that materialized that were just doing screenshots of people and putting their names and information on them. Sometimes there is a list, but it isn't visible to the public. It'll be a dox list or a watch list that's on the dark web and some of the ugliest and darkest corners of the internet. Both of those things end up having more or less the same effect, which is that they'll spur a massive harassment campaign where tons of different individuals, tons of different accounts will pile onto one person or a group of people. The thing that's tricky about doxing is it's not super easy to define. You can say that it's the publishing of personal identifiable information, but what does that actually mean? Is it only a home address or could it be other things? And people often don't know that they've been placed on a watch list. What will happen is they'll start to see their name all of a sudden and their personal information, like their home address, circulating on social media or on websites, or they'll start to get suddenly an influx of abusive and threatening emails or calls or text messages or social media DMs, sometimes even physical mail, and they don't understand why this is happening. And then they'll go online and realize that they've been doxxed. Sometimes people even show up outside their home or at their work or at an event they're at. It usually will last, this kind of really intense part of it will last for 3 to 7 days, and then the storm will blow over. But those 3 to 7 days can be pretty hellish. And sometimes there are then flare-ups. If you try to then speak out and defend yourself, there might be another flare-up. It can be a really scary experience. This is a really difficult thing to go through and requires one to be kind to oneself and understand that it's normal to have a response of fear. Sometimes people have a fight, flight, or freeze response too.
When it comes to platforms, are there particular sites or social media spaces that have become especially hostile? For me, for example, X comes to mind.
Oh, X.
And interestingly, in a November 2025 article, The Guardian reported that a new transparency tool on X allows users to see where accounts are located, and that many of the most influential personalities in the MAGA movement are based outside the US, including Russia, Nigeria, and India, noting that bots spreading misinformation and propaganda has been a long-running problem on X, a problem that has been significantly exacerbated since Elon Musk bought it in October of 2022.
The thing that's really strange about online harassment, and particularly coordinated harassment campaigns, is that they are often made to feel really targeted. You're like, oh, this is really about me. They're talking to you, they're using your name, they're maybe using your information. But the reality is a lot of these campaigns are extremely coordinated and organized. They're often coordinated and organized by people who are outside the country. They're posing as, Americans who just feel very strongly about something, but actually they're like a bot army that is in some other part of the world that might be trying to just make money, because you can make really good money by spreading hate, harassment, and lies. Strangely enough, you can monetize that. Sometimes it's because foreign governments are really interested in destabilizing our political ecosystem and they want us all to fight each other. And so they'll just go around pretending to be Americans, seeding all this garbage everywhere. I wasn't surprised when they instituted this transparency tool. They discovered that so many of these accounts were all over the world. Many of us who could do this work have known that for a long time. What I was surprised by is that X put a tool like this in place. I was grateful to them, but it's very unusual and I don't know how long it'll last. I have a friend who taught me this phrase. He said, the internet is an amplification machine. It takes whatever is happening in society and just amplifies it. And so you will find hate, harassment, and threat on just about any social media. However, some platforms take it a lot more seriously than others and actually invest staff time and financial resources to mitigate it, and other platforms don't. Platforms like Twitch and Blue Sky, they're not perfect, but they do actually invest people time and money into policies, tools, content moderation systems, etc. So they actually care about hate and harassment and they try. Doesn't mean they always get it right, but they try. X, unfortunately, has become notoriously toxic. We spent many, many years working with Twitter, trying to improve its safety protocols and tools. And there was a stretch of time where we actually found Twitter to be a very responsive partner. They had built out their trust and safety teams. They had all these people who really cared. And we were working very closely with those people. And then, unfortunately, Musk took over Twitter and fired all of the trust and safety professionals, loosened harassment policies. Not all, but many of them. And he even threatened to kill the block button, which people are, it's like one of the only tools you can still use on X to protect yourself. As far as I know, he hasn't done that yet, but who knows? And so that's why I was surprised they had this transparency. I think a tool like that is fantastic. It's just completely different from all the other ways in which they've deliberately allowed hate, harassment, disinformation to run rampant on the platform. Unfortunately, many platforms have been following X's race to the bottom. If you look at the front row of the inauguration, it was heads of all of the tech companies. And those folks within days loosened their hate and harassment policies, but they didn't loosen them for everyone. They just focused on the groups that the administration goes after, like trans folks and immigrants. And so it's really hard to say that was a coincidence. It's clearly not. The thing that I find kind of ironic is that I'm not actually sure that in the long term, it's good for their business models because X has had a pretty big exodus of people. There are a lot of people who don't use X anymore, myself included, because it has become so toxic that the kind of experience you have on it is so negative that it is hard to see the positives. It's not clear to me that this strategy of a race to the bottom to allow hate and harassment to thrive on platforms is going to be good for these companies, even from the standpoint of their bottom line.
Let's talk about what people can actually do. What are some of the concrete steps?
There are things that are happening in this country right now that are very concerning and that we should be clear-eyed about. There's harassment and the government is going after academics and scholars and all these other folks. I mean, yes, those things are bad and we should be honest about the fact that they're bad. But I want people to really walk away with an understanding that they have so much more power and control and agency than they may think that they do, including in terms of their safety on the internet.
This is super, super important.
We just need to understand what we're dealing with so that we can be prepared to push back and protect ourselves. The thing about digital security is we always think that you have to have this extraordinary level of technical knowledge and sophistication to keep yourself safe online. I'm telling you, you don't actually. You don't actually have to have an enormous amount of technical knowledge. You need to be willing to invest a little bit of time and energy and to follow some very core steps. They're not simple, but they're not technically complicated. They just take time. So I'll tell you what some of those steps are. So the first thing to do is put locks on your most sensitive online accounts. So sit down for a minute, write a list of your top 10 most sensitive accounts. That might be things like your email account, your social media accounts, maybe your banking or financial accounts, maybe your health insurance or health portal, like, medical health portal accounts. Write those down. There's probably 10 of them, maybe there's 15 of them. And make sure that you have 2 locks on those accounts. The first lock is a long, complicated, secure password that does not use your name or your birthday. And the second lock is something called two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, which is when that you get sent a code and you have to enter the code. So your first lock is your password. Let's say that your password is not very long and complicated, which is bad. You want it to be long and complicated.
My passwords are generally 16 and above, and I have a password manager that assists with that. Do you recommend that?
Yeah, totally. I'm really glad you brought that up. So you want to have passwords that are at least 16 characters. Because of machine learning, because of automated systems, there are now tools that will just keep churning through permutations of a few letters until they find your password and then they get in. And if your password is really, really long and you remember anything from high school math, from a kind of probability standpoint, the longer your password is, the longer it'll take a computer to guess. And if it takes a computer 3 millennia to guess your password, they're not going to get it. So if you have a 16-character password, that's a lot safer, especially if you don't use your name or birthday. And then the two-factor authentication, what happens is if someone somehow cracks your password, that code is that extra lock that says, wait a minute, but are you actually who you say you are? Give me that code and then I'll let you in. Because it can be really difficult to remember a dozen or even 100 long, complicated passwords, a lot of folks use password managers. Now, Password Manager will create long, complicated passwords for you and autofill them for you, and it will store them for you. That freaks people out a little bit because they're like, well, why would I want all of my passwords in one place? And the truth is not all password managers are good. Some of them are good. Some of them are not. Some password managers I can recommend are 1Password or Dashlane or Bitwarden. if you look up Consumer Reports or Wirecutter or those kinds of outlets, they will tell you what's a good password manager. You can read some reviews and pick a good one. So that's the first thing, is put locks on your most sensitive accounts. The next thing is really to start pulling apart your personal and your professional identity online. And that's hard because those of us who are not digital native, and I count myself in that category, when Facebook first came on and Twitter and other of these online platforms came on, they asked you for as much information as possible. Your favorite books, your favorite music, where were you born, everywhere you ever lived. And we all kind of gleefully gave all that information because we didn't know any better. We didn't realize they were surveilling us. They kind of pushed us into a realm where all of our personal and professional presence online is completely fused, but that's actually extremely risky. For example, if you are posting photos of your baby or your dog or your home, including where you could see actually the home number or the street number, you don't want to be doing that on a public facing Twitter account, because that means that some creepy people might find you or know what your baby is called or what they look like. You want an X account that might be public facing where you publish your work, but you're not posting photos of your baby or your house on that account. Maybe you have a private Instagram account where you post photos of your baby in your house. Two things I'll mention in this kind of realm are tightening your privacy and security settings on social media platforms so that some of your accounts are more private and some are more public, because the social media platforms will default you to public settings everywhere because they want you to share as much as possible. And then you have to go in and dig through the settings and fix them. But you can take back that power and control and say, hey, I'm not going to let you manipulate me like this or exploit me like this. And you can also clean up your online footprint. You can look at what kind of information is available about you on the internet. And do you want all that to be there, or do you want some of it to go away?
Yeah, so one of the suggested tips I saw mentioned as a best practice was the suggestion to delete old social media posts. What kind of posts should people actually focus on, and how far back should they go?
If you are listening to this podcast and you are someone who was very active on social media when you were a teenager or an early 20-something, this is for you. In general, it is a good idea to archive anything that is more than a few years old. You don't necessarily have to delete it. You can delete it. You can delete old accounts and you can delete old posts. But if you don't want to, if you don't want to lose that, you can archive them, but then make sure they're not publicly visible. And you certainly want to delete anything, what do they call it, mouthing off about when you were a teenager and had all kinds of sassy views that you maybe don't necessarily hold anymore or want someone to surface. But my rule of thumb is pretty simple. How would you feel if this particular post ended up entirely out of context on the front page of the New York Times or the AP or some other major publication? If you don't want that to happen, you should clean up that post. People change over the course of a life. And also, none of us fully understood how to use online platforms when they first came on the scene. I think some of us thought at first that they were kind of smaller and more private, and they were when they started, but they became much bigger and more public. Our settings are such that everything is still visible and we don't realize it. And so we may not have understood that we were talking to 2 billion people as opposed to 300 people or 20 people, but that is what's happening. Facebook has something called Manage Activity, which helps you do it. That's built into the platform. On Twitter, you have to use third-party tools like SID, CYD, or Tweet Deleter. Some of them are free, some of them cost money, but they will automatically archive all of your tweets within a certain date range that you give it. Whatever works better for you, I would highly recommend cleaning up your old posts so that they don't surprise you, unexpectedly.
When I did that, I also realized that I had left comments on other people's social media posts. So I actually went in and looked at those comments, and that took even more time. I'm not somebody who's posting crazy stuff online, but maybe I don't want to be connected to that post anymore. So I think that's an area that people tend to forget about. It's not just what they actively are posting themselves, but where they're engaging.
I think that's really smart and an excellent point. I'm glad you mentioned that.
There are data scrubbing companies that erase personal information online. What exactly do they do? And can you maybe offer the name of one or two companies that are reputable?
The United States has a particularly strange American phenomenon called data brokers. You've seen the websites. They're things like White Pages or Intellius or Spokio. And these companies, it'll boggle your mind, it boggles mine. They're completely legal. What they will do is they will scoop up all of your private sensitive information online, your home address, everyone you're related to, every car you've ever owned, and the make and model of it, and the color of it, and on and on and on. They will scoop up all that information and they will sell it literally for pennies to whoever wants it on the internet. And that is legal in the United States. That is not legal in most every other country in the world, but it is legal here. What we need to solve this problem at scale is federal privacy legislation that prevents that kind of stuff from happening. It is completely bonkers that this is legal. In the meanwhile, because people will always find a way to make a profit, there are companies that erase all of this information for you. all of these data brokers are required to have a quote unquote opt out system. So technically, if you ask them to remove your information, they have to, but they make it as difficult and complicated as possible to do it. And so it's just incredibly time consuming, and there are hundreds of data brokers. If you buy a data scrubbing subscription, what they will do is they will go to all of these data brokers and demand that these data brokers remove your information. And then the data brokers, after 6 to 8 months, will put your information back. They're not stopped doing that in any way. And so then the company that you've hired will go in and tell them, take it down again. You can manually remove all of your information from data scrubbers. There's this incredible list made by a tech journalist called the Big Ass Data Broker Opt-out List. It's a reporter named Yael Brower. I highly recommend, if you're going to do it manually, use that list, Big Ass Data Broker Opt-out List. But if you don't want to do it manually, you can use companies like Delete Me, Canary, Optory, or Easy Opt-outs. Those are some that I know.
Suppose one of the worst things happens and somebody is doxxed. I know there's been a sharp increase on college campuses in the last couple of years, for example. What immediate steps should someone take to try to regain their sense of safety and control?
Let me answer that in two ways. So I'm going to tell you what are some of the basic things to do if you experience any kind of severe online harassment. And then I'll tell you about kind of what to do if it's doxing specifically, because doxing is a very particular form of online harassment. So if it's any kind of harassment, I would say, first of all, it is okay to just say out loud to yourself or to other people, this totally sucks. Like, it's a horrible experience to have someone bombard you with hateful slurs or publish your home address or threaten you or threaten the people you love. It's an awful, traumatic experience. It often activates people's fight or flight response. If you feel upset, it's okay. It makes sense that you feel upset. And the next thing I would say is try to sit with the idea that it isn't your fault. I think many of us will immediately go, oh, I should have done it differently, and then this wouldn't have happened. When in fact, you are not to blame, but the person that is abusing and terrorizing you is to blame. It may feel that you're very much alone in that experience, but you're probably not. Reaching out to people you trust, that could be friends, family, colleagues, it could be your supervisor, it could be an assistant you have. And there are a bunch of things those folks can help you do. They can help you monitor your online accounts and help you document and report abuse. Basically, look at things for you so you don't have to look at them, but then alert you if there's something they're concerned about, like a threat. You might be able to delegate access to some of your accounts temporarily to those folks and then take your accounts back when you've had a break. And I would say things like taking a break from online accounts and devices if you can, even if just for a few hours or a few days, just to regroup. Anything that makes you feel happy and centered and loved. It might be going outside in nature. It might be drawing. It might be journaling. It might be screaming into a pillow, whatever. The last thing I'll say is that if you've experienced really severe online harassment and it's significantly impacted your emotional and psychological well-being, like let's say you're not sleeping or you're not eating or you are really anxious all the time or something like that, I really recommend talking to a professional. Online hate and harassment has a real physiological and emotional toll sometimes, and sometimes you really need professional help. I had promised to come back to this question of what do you do if it's specifically doxing? And doxing is a little bit different than other forms of hate and harassment, especially if someone has published your home address, has put online where your kids go to school. It's kind of a different thing. And so I want to flag some of the things that you would do there. And I will just say we did publish a guide on what to do if you've been doxed or placed on a watch list. First thing to do is actually center yourself, which is completely counterintuitive. That might be deep breathing, that might be sitting down for a minute, just to kind of regroup before you start taking action. The second thing to do is to figure out if you feel physically unsafe. Do you feel unsafe in your home or at your workplace? And if that is the case, you may want to talk to law enforcement. If you're not comfortable engaging with law enforcement, you may want to talk to your employer if it's about your workplace, or even just go stay with a friend that you trust for a couple of days. And then you can sit down and really tighten your social media privacy. Go on your accounts, make some of them private for a few days. Once it blows over, you can make them public again, and have someone help you document and report abuse. So those are some of the basic things to do. And as I said with the other forms of abuse, reach out to other people for help. Don't go it alone, because it is really isolating and can feel really intimidating to do it by yourself. But if you have people help you, they will feel so glad that they could do something for you at such a scary moment. And you will feel glad that you're not alone and someone is bearing some of the burden of cleaning this up or dealing with the aftermath of it.
Right. And I think that's so important, because I've heard you say that peer support can be a lifeline, and that meaningful support from colleagues or friends or institutions when somebody's going through something like this can make them feel less alone and able to weather the storm, whatever that period of time is, those couple of days that you mentioned at its most extreme.
I talk about peer support because it's what people who have faced really egregious intimidation have told me helps them. So I've been working with folks who experience hate, harassment, and threats for many, many years. And often people will think that what got them through it is the technical steps. And the technical steps help, the digital security steps. But that's not usually what gets people through. What gets people through is peer support and human support. It could be friends and family. It could be colleagues. It could be an alumni group that you're part of or some other group that you're part of. I think we know this for physical abuse. We know that physical abuse is meant to be isolating, but so is online abuse. Just talking to someone about what you're facing, why you're upset, and if you are up here or the ally to sort of help people understand that they're not alone, that you've got their back, that it's not their fault that they're being targeted. If you are an ally and someone's been doxxed and they're afraid to be in their home, you can let them stay with you. You can offer to stay with them for a few days. You can bring people food. And you can also do some of the technical stuff. Like you can actually monitor abuse for someone, document it, report it, screen for threats of physical violence and tell them that you've seen something concerning so that they don't have to look at every single DM and email and nasty voicemail, but someone else is doing it for them. That's stuff that you can do privately. There's also things that individuals and institutions can do publicly. They may be able to make a public-facing statement of support. But better yet, what I tell people is don't fixate on the abuser. Instead, lift up the person being abused. So let's say that you see a journalist or a writer who posted something online and then they get horrific harassment. Don't engage with the harassment. Instead, promote the work that they were trying to put out into the world and say, you know what, this is actually excellent journalism, or I really like this piece, and forget the harasser, right? But if you are an ally, don't focus on the harasser. Focus on lifting up the person who is trying to speak and who's trying to be silenced. One of the questions I get the most in the trainings that we run is, should I feed the trolls? I actually think that that is the wrong question. The standard party line has always been, never feed the trolls. I actually think that that's not particularly thoughtful or nuanced advice, but I'll explain why. If what you're talking about by feeding the trolls is to turn around and abuse the abuser back and call them a bunch of names and try to sick a mob against them, that's not constructive or helpful because it will just perpetuate the cycle of hate, harassment, and violence. If you're talking about trying to prove to an abusive troll that they're wrong and you're right, you can try. It'll probably be a waste of your time and stress you out. And they probably wanted to have your attention and then they got it. But that is not the same as actually using your voice, defending yourself, and practicing counter speech. And here's what I mean by that. Counter speech might be, I refuse to stop publishing my work and speaking because you want to shut me up. So instead of paying attention to you, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, keep putting it out into the world. And here are my allies who have my back and who are supporting me. That's counter speech, but that's not calling an abuser a bunch of abusive names. Counter speech might also be doing that for someone else. There's a wonderful reporter, Brandy Zadrozny, who reports on disinformation. And there was a period of time Tucker Carlson started to talk about her when he still had his TV show. And unfortunately, when Tucker Carlson talks about you on your show, especially if you're a female reporter, you are going to be bombarded with death threats and hate. Her newsroom issued a public statement of support, and then a sea of reporters that had worked with her for many, many years went online and said she's a fantastic reporter, and here are links to her work. You should read it. They didn't get too fixated on Tucker Carlson. That would have been a waste of time, but they practiced counter speech. They actually really lifted her up, and she also stuck up for herself. And so I think that that's the important distinction to make about feeding the trolls versus using your voice and not being silenced.
Yeah, that's brilliant advice. You've been at PEN America for over 8 years, a period when the online space has changed dramatically. Are there new kinds of challenges you're seeing now that didn't exist a few years ago?
So there are things that have gotten worse and there are things that have gotten better. The attacks that we saw years ago, mostly targeting journalists, have now spread to writers, scholars, librarians, public health officials, and so many other people who are trying to do their work and use their voices. So that has been a pretty disturbing trajectory, is just how much these kinds of harassment campaigns are spreading to more and more people. We've also seen governments and various political interest groups get much better at coordinating and unleashing attacks like this at scale. And these watch lists that we were talking about are just one of the many tools. There was a time when Twitter was making a lot of progress and now it's been backsliding. Same with Meta. Meta was making a lot of progress. Now it's been backsliding. Google too. And so I think that is something to note. I think the rise of generative AI and deepfakes is making it easier than ever to abuse people at scale on the internet for very cheap or for free. Those are things that are bigger challenges that are concerning to me. The things that have given me more hope, a couple things. One, I think that way more people now understand what online harassment is and why it's bad. So many of us have now seen it. The other thing is that with enough public pressure, with enough making it bad for business for them, we can choose to take our eyeballs and our business and our attention elsewhere and not stay on platforms that are making our lives miserable. And I think that people are starting to understand they have some of that power. And the last thing that really gives me hope is that when I talk to folks who grew up in the era of the internet, the most recent couple generations are actually more aware of their privacy, more thoughtful about security and privacy, and trying to push back against these big corporations than people my age. They can take back some of the power, agency, and control that some of us haven't figured out how to do.
In line with that, are there any other emerging cultural shifts or technologies that you see that can perhaps help us reclaim digital spaces for open dialogue and truth-based journalism?
I'm not sure folks who are not in the sector understand the degree to which the journalism sector is being reborn and transformed for the good. I mean, I think the fact that so many outlets have shut down is horrible and concerning. And the fact that the federal government and many state governments are so aggressively attacking the press, particularly local outlets, is concerning and horrible. But what's been amazing is that there have been so many outlets that have cropped up. It's kind of like a golden age. They just don't have enough money, but they're doing amazing work. There's so many outlets that have cropped up that are local, community centered, that are really cutting edge. So I'll give you a couple of names. Places like Outlier Media in Detroit, or there's an outlet called Connect to Arizona in Arizona. There's the 19th, which reports on women, or MLK 50, which reports on poverty and policy in Tennessee and beyond. There's 100 Days in Appalachia. And the reason I mention these outlets is that one of the things they're doing is they're experimenting with technology and they're trying to meet their audiences where they are. Instead of telling their audience, well, we know what you want because we're smart journalists and here's what we think you should know, they're actually listening to what their audiences are telling them they want and then reaching them there. So, for example, some of these outlets have WhatsApp helplines where people can write a WhatsApp channel and say, hey, I'm worried that they've cut off water in my neighborhood and I don't know why. Do you know what's going on? And the reporter will say, yeah, we've had reports. Or there are these cafecitos, which are these kind of wonderful open town halls almost on Zoom that some outlets are running, where their community will come and they'll ask reporters 1,000,001 questions and they'll tell reporters, hey, this has been happening and I'm worried about it. There are things like in-person gatherings. There are people who've been trying to go back to print products, but maybe zines or flyers. And some of the most innovative stuff has been lo-fi. It's just been as basic as human beings talking to other human beings and asking regular people, what is worrying you? What do you need? What do you want? How can I help you as a journalist? As opposed to, let me tell you what you need as a journalist. In terms of tech, it's a little hard to be optimistic right now. AI can make hate and harassment and threats easier, but it can also better detect those attacks and potentially proactively shield people from them, label them. We just wrote a report called Treating Online Abuse as Spam. Imagine if you could go onto a social media platform and there would be some kind of tool that used machine learning to automatically detect abusive content and hide it from you, not hide it from everyone else on the internet, but just hide it from you and shove it in a folder somewhere or in a dashboard somewhere. And then you could choose when you went in there and looked at what was there. And let's say you could delegate access to a trusted friend who could tell you if there was a death threat in there. And if it's just a bunch of insults, you don't have to look at them. They can report them for you. Or if there's a threat, they would tell you. So these are things that are completely technically feasible to build, but platforms have rarely, if ever, built them. That kind of stuff would make me optimistic if we could just get platforms to spend some money on those kinds of tools.
I would love for you to tell people where they can find you online to learn more about your work.
Our digital safety program, which again serves writers, journalists, scholars, and librarians in the US, if you were to search online for PEN America Digital Safety Program or Digital Safety, you'll find us. We have written a bunch of reports on how tech companies can better address online abuse. Reports are Treating Online Abuse Like Spam, Shouting into the Void, which is about how difficult it is to report abuse to platforms and get them to do anything about it. And one called No Excuse for Abuse, which was 40 pages of recommendations for social media companies and tech companies about how they can protect and support people facing abuse without impinging on free expression. And then if you are someone who has experienced harassment or is afraid of experiencing harassment, we have this online resource totally free called the Field Manual Against Online Harassment, which has detailed guidance from lawyers, psychologists, technologists, writers, journalists, and other people about what to do if you are under attack and how to protect yourself before you're under attack. And finally, do take a look at our tip sheet on what to do if you've been doxxed or placed on a watch list. You can find all the instructions you need on how to handle that situation.
Viktorya, thanks so much for having taken the time today.
I am so grateful to you for having me here. It was my absolute pleasure. Thank you.